Welcome. It's Memorial Day weekend. We're here. Thank you for being here. And I think we'll be peeling off layers after we've pulled out all the down jackets in the last few days. It got warm all of a sudden, but thank you so much for being here. I'm so pleased to introduce, this is our third season of Long Island Modern with Alastair Gordon. Thank you, yes. It's been such a pleasure to host this here at Longhouse. And yeah, this is the third season. We'll have 5 presentations, I think, this year. And this is the first one on art villages. I just want to make a note also, Lee Skolnick, who has been integral to this, these presentations into this series, unfortunately sends his regrets. He couldn't be here today, but he has been a part of every lecture, and we look forward to having him in the future again. Alastair, we need to introduce you. Well, I think we should. So, and maybe you all know who Alastair is. Alastair Gordon is an award-winning critic, cultural historian, author, and filmmaker. And Publishers Weekly wrote, "Gordon's eye for the convergence of art, architecture, and commerce is unerring." For more than 20 years, he wrote on art, architecture, and the environment for the New York Times, and in 2008 became contributing editor on design for the Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal magazine. The Wall Street Journal, the Wall Street Journal magazine. Gordon's essays have been published in many other publications, including Architectural Digest, Vanity Fair, Le Monde, Architectural Record, New York Observer, House and Garden, and Dwell. I know for me, I've known your book, Weekend Utopia, since I was a toddler. No, I'm kidding. No, it's always a reference for me. In addition to his critical journalism, Gordon has published more than 28 books on art, architecture, and environment, including such critically acclaimed titles as Weekend Utopia, Naked Airport, which is coming soon to Longhouse, Spaced Out, Theater of Shopping, Architectonica, Romantic Modernist, Island Follies, and Wandering Forms. In 2016, he launched Poetics of Place, a critical writing program at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and has taught and lectured at many other institutions. He is a co-founder and editorial director of Gordon de Vries Studio, a publishing imprint that specializes in books about the human environment. One special note, which, as many of you may have come to the presentation on Norman Jaffe, Alastair is currently making a feature documentary about Norman Jaffe, and there is going to be, and he can tell you more, but there is going to be a presentation on June 12th, so coming up soon, on the East End, and so you will please mark your calendars for that. I also today wanted to introduce, we'll have coming, and this is why we needed to sort out all the Zoom stuff, and the Zoom gods smiled on us, I hope. We have a friend who will talk with Alastair, and that's Morgan Puett, who is an American fashion designer and interdisciplinary contemporary artist. She first became known for her fashion designs and later for her contemporary art practice incorporating fashion. Now, what she is featured today is because with Mark Dion, she is a founder of the Mildred's Lane Project, an experimental artist residency program. And that is on a 96-acre farm in Berlin Township in Pennsylvania. And the residency focuses on social and political practice in the arts. So I think that covers it, Alastair. So I will let you take the mic, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Esperanza. Yes, may the Zoom gods shine down on us today, because this is way beyond my technical capabilities to zoom in with Morgan, who's a great friend and a great friend of our family, and has worked with all my daughters and everybody, is in, as she said, in northeastern Pennsylvania. And so this idea, which I started years ago, I did a piece for a magazine on the art village in Southampton, and there wasn't that much material on it. I thought, this is the coolest little community, these little cottages And that's, in fact, a young woman artist in front of this original studio in 1880-something. And then I always started to collect, I mean, this is sort of comes out of the same work I did on Weekend Utopia and the Long on Modern series we've been doing here. But it's a little bit different because it goes further afield than Long Island, obviously. But the idea of how artists are so used to working in solitude, and then what happens when they decide they want to be part of a community or a collective. It might be a radical political movement. It might be just an art school, like the Art Village in Southampton was basically just, an art school built around William Merritt Chase, and the idea of plein air painting. God, my French is terrible. The idea of getting out in nature instead of sitting in a stuffy Victorian studio, and that seemed to be kind of the leverage by which, if this is a movement, it's not really a movement, it's sort of a, unformed thing that happens every few generations in reaction to different things. And I just love the idea of what kind of collective synergy happens when artists who might be radically different in spirit, but, are looking for some kind of supportive community. One of the things I came across that I found fascinating is Paul Goodman. I'm sure some of you here know Paul or knew Paul, and Percy, his brother. Percy lived out here quite a while, and they were both pretty radical leftists. They wrote a book called Comunitas, which inspired a lot of, the first edition was 48, something like that, but the idea of, a new kind of community. They were always accused of being communists and Marxists, but actually they weren't. They were anti-Marxists. They're more like anarchists. And Paul wrote this brilliant idea that these communities shouldn't really, it's better that they don't last that long. The very transitional, I'm sorry, it's hard for me to read it here because of the sun. Such intensely motivated, intentional communities is part of their perfection. Disintegrating, they irradiate society with people who've been profoundly touched by the excitement of community life. I think that's a huge part of this. The story is that the idea is to keep together. There are a few that have last 50 years. There's one even that's lasted now. I think has an anniversary of 75 years. Usually they fall apart after 2 or 3 years because they're either there's just ego clash, there's not enough money, there's something wrong with wherever it is. And Morgan Puett will talk to this because she's not only the co-founder of Mildred's Lane Complexity, but she's kept it going, almost single-handedly some years, for 25 years now, which is kind of extraordinary. And artists come and go, there are different periods, there are different kind of group dynamics, and sometimes it works really well, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's an oddball character who just ruins everything, which I'm really interested in. That's very common. So I tend to be encyclopedic when I get a new idea for something, so excuse me for going too far back in history, but I want to begin with sort of the idea of the exceptionalism, and I hate that word usually with America, but in terms of the idea of nature and how different it was from European perceptions of nature. Thomas Cole's famous painting, which is very much about his experience of coming from England, where everything was still fairly contained and controlled in nature, and just being kind of blown away by the wildness in American nature. And this painting, on the left, there's a lightning storm in the background. That tree's been blasted by lightning or something. Even he's, if you look closely at the real painting, he's down with that little umbrella sticking up. That's actually Thomas Cole down there painting. And then to the right of the painting is the oxbow, the famous oxbow in the Connecticut River. And then it's pastures. It's cultivated landscape. It's sort of what's happening to the wildness of American nature. In wildness is the preservation of the world throughout. So it really begins with the transcendentalists. Cole then builds his house up the Hudson, along with several other Hudson. But he's really the first to claim the Hudson Valley as this kind of ideal porch onto nature. And literally, there's the porch looking out over the valley, his studio. I'll quickly go through this material. Something happens, kind of mid-century to the beginning of the Civil War. This idealized wildness of nature is really polluted and tainted. I know this photograph is still incredibly upsetting, even, so many years later. Matthew Brady's photograph of the dead. Brady was accused, I don't think this is true, but Brady was accused, another photographer did move corpses around and reposition cannonballs to get a better composition, but I don't think Brady did this. He was accused of that in this photograph. So this idea of this innocence and beauty of American nature, gets incredibly tainted in a way by these scenes by Brady and other photographers in Civil War, during the Civil War. So to get back to Long Island, eastern Long Island, not that long after the end of the Civil War, this group of artists called the Tile Club, and I'm sure most of you here know about the Tile Club, and there've been a lot of talks about them, but under the sponsorship of Scribner's Monthly, and weirdly enough, the Long Island Railroad, who was very invested in developing land that the railroad had built, through the wastelands of eastern Long Island. So they sponsored this trip, and then this writer in Scribner's kind of a scene of freshness and uncontaminated splendor, such as they had no idea existed 100 miles from New York. This is the perception of the writer and the artist coming out on the train. The train only went as far as Bridgehampton, so they got off at Bridgehampton and then were picked up by carriages and other means of transportation. The woods rolled gloriously over the hills, wild as those around the Scotch lakes, noble amphitheaters of tree-tufted mountains, raked by roaring winds. I haven't seen that in a while out here. Caught the changing light from a cloud-swept heaven. All was pure nature, fresh from creation. The beach they skirted was wild and stern with magnificent precipices. So, this writer is being paid for by the Long Island Railroad Company, which is kind of interesting. So this land that they bought for almost nothing, the right of way along the railway, and then thousands of acres around it. Like, I think they owned around 5,000 acres of Shinnecock Hills. So the artists come out and find little just housing in barns and in little guest homes. Those are the tiles on the right that the Tile Club would make of their trips. That's them painting in East Hampton, 1878. Winslow Homer, and of course there were already artists like Winslow Homer and Chase and Thomas Moran coming out here, and I know you know this, that's Thomas Moran's house that's been beautifully restored in East Hampton. Moran's, he brought this back from Venice, and we'd go around in Hook Pond, which Henry's painting of, it looks so busy, the beach in 1881. You think it's bad now, it was pretty bad then too. This always fascinated me, the idea that, again, this writer came out, it's so hard to see this, I'm sorry. Sites in the Shinnecock Hill that had been worth $2.50 a few years before were now fetching $250 for an acre, wrote John Gilmer Speed in Harper's Monthly, August 1892. So all these artists start coming out. The landscape paintings begin to be shown at exhibitions in New York, at museums and galleries. And suddenly this worthless land that 20 years earlier, if you read Travelers before the Civil War, they describe the stretch from, let's say, Amagansett to Montauk as just wasteland, And much of the beach still had shipwrecks on it. And it was kind of a place of misery and death, and, pre-Civil War. And then this, completely different idea, this different perception of the landscape and the place really changed after this period, largely due to poets, like Whitman was writing about Montauk, and painters like Chase and Moran. They changed the public perception, which directly went into real estate value, which is kind of extraordinary. Chase creating his own little shelter for the mosquitoes on the beach. Howard, he's not very well known, Butler, but that's one of it's the first house, I think it's the first house in East Hampton that was a private home built on the dunes, purposely built on the dunes of the ocean, because he was an ocean painter, and he would just sit on his porch and paint the ocean. That's interesting. I don't know, I think that might have been washed away, I'm not sure. But it was the first, there had been Coast Guard buildings and stuff like that right on the dunes, but not a private residence, because it was feared that was a dangerous place, which it is, but people don't listen to that anymore. Chase's house by Stanford White up in the hills, Shinnecock Hills, a very important base for Chase to get out of the city, paint his children. There's that famous painting of the parish, the bayberry bush. That's the house by Stanford White in the background. Then just down the hills, closer into Southampton, not far from the Shinnecock reservation, a group of wealthy madams, not madams, I don't mean that, dames, I didn't mean that, madams of the night. I mean lovely Southampton, socially conscious dames, bought this piece of property and subdivided it into little, and it was called the Art Village, and you can find it still in local records and stuff. And that was started in 1891 as the first outdoor school of art. There you see the subdivision. And it had, there was Ochre Lane and Studio Way, and that rustic, that studio building was at the center, again, very much about a return to American kind of almost frontier rusticity, with the huge boulder kind of chimney and the logs on the outside of and the sort of the rustic porch and everything. And inside, I've never found a good photograph of the original inside of the studio, but it was a big open space, and it had this wonderful contraption that was like a four-sided easel, and students would kind of put their paintings up, and Chase would sort of walk around and kind of criticize them. And there were these Chase days that were like, I think Tuesday and Wednesday, Chase would come out. This is someone I always wanted to know more about. She's an English painter. She was sort of second on the list of teachers at the Art Village. Rhoda Nichols, a very good English painter, landscape painter. That's a self-portrait she did. And she taught, she specialized in watercolors and taught the watercolor program. This is a great little, not long after Art Village opened, there was this novel called, what's it called? Witch Winnie at Shinnecock Hills. And a toy village, Millie called it. So it's this kind of a cute novel about two young women who go to the Art Village to study art. A toy village, Millie called it, with its handful of tiny cottages grouped about the great studio and separated from each other with make-believe rustic fences, only a few inches of height. I can't imagine a few inches in height. That's hard to comprehend. Tiny cabins with almost an affectation of rusticity in their unpainted, rough exteriors, slightly put together, but clean and new, and each with its rough fireplace, its irregular windows, its cozy piazza, and its odd corners which differentiated it from its neighbors and gave scope to the individual decorative fancy of its occupants. This adorable little storybook. And you could go, but you had to bring, and she was, Catherine Budd, who I wish I knew more about. She was a really interesting artist, but she was also an architect and designed or redesigned some of the cottages. I never found that much about who the architects of each building was. But in this, if you were going to stay in Porter Cottage, you had to be a woman, you had to bring 2 teaspoons, you had to bring 2 tablespoons. And my favorite of all is you had to bring your, at least one napkin ring. And she was kind of hung up about napkin rings. And if someone is coming, but they're not staying at Porter College, but they're eating at Porter Cottage, you have to bring your own napkin ring. Don't expect us to provide a napkin ring for you. So you had to really be prepared before you go. But I love this idea. And then these were the days, it's Mondays and Tuesdays were Chase days. So you would not just sit in the studio, if it wasn't raining, you'd go out into the Shinnecock Hills or near the beach with Chase himself and with easels and setup. And the idea was to paint directly with oil, not do just exterior sketches, but set up with all your oil paints and actually paint directly on. And then, 2 days later, I think on Thursday, you would be able to work on the painting a little more in your studio and then show it to Chase as a finished project. But you had to start actually with, brush and oil paint outside in the hills. There were guys, it was mainly women, but there were guys, and this is called the Rembrandt, this little shack. I don't know if they lived there, if they painted there. They look like kind of mischievous males. I don't know anything about them. This is a postcard I found, which I've never seen anywhere else. Fortunately, some of the cottages have been saved, but it hasn't been preserved as which it should have been, as a single community, as an exceptional resource, this historic village. So some of the cottages have been fixed up and moved away to other sites, so it's but some of them are still there. Across the, pretty much around the same period, across the Sound, in Old Lyme, Connecticut, you had this group, which was really started by this woman named Florence Griswold. I'm sure a lot of you have been to the Florence Griswold Museum. It's worth a trip in Old Lyme. And she basically, ended up in this house that was her family's house, a big kind of mansion in Old Lyme, and didn't know what to do with it, wasn't married, didn't have an income. So she opened it to artists, and she became, in a way, the guru of this artist colony. And there she is. And one of the paybacks, the only paybacks you had to do, if you would be invited, you'd stay at the boarding house, but you'd have to do a painting for the house. So all through the house, and you can see them still, are these panels, these beautiful landscape pieces that have been built into the walls of the dining room and the living room. And it's, again, they're there. And another requirement was you had to come to dinner. You can see the women, the wives are shunted to the back table there, and the guys get to talk about their painful experiences in nature. There's one of the great collections there is this painting that's, you can see kind of in the top. Can you guys see from here with the sun on it and everything? Yeah, it's okay. So that's by several artists there who just collaborated on the scene. It's kind of a jocular outing in the country. There they all are jammed together. It's kind of up the Connecticut River a little ways from and there's still a couple other cottages that were used. It's very interesting. Childe Hassam was probably I guess was really the best known of the painters. Childe Hassam had a house in East Hampton too. He kind of got around, but he was quite dedicated to the Old Lyme group. This I don't really want to talk about, but there's something about these arts and crafts communities. Roycroft is one of them. There are a couple of others on the East Coast around the same period. But it is surprising how, again, not directly to do with the Civil War, but at some point after that period, within a 10-year period, within a decade period, you had about 12 or 15 of these kind of artist communities. And some were started as schools, like the Art Village, but some were kind of utopian communities with a real philosophy and purpose. And this Albert Hubbard, who's sort of creepy looking in that photograph, L. Ron Hubbard was his son or his nephew or something. So there's a legacy of weirdness in the family. And this is, I don't know if you've ever been there, it's way upstate New York, but it's, they make that furniture and the pottery, and it's all beautiful, and it's very, very, very expensive at auction now and stuff like that. But there's something slightly culty about the William Morris groups for some reason, so I won't go into. This is another one, which is Birdcliff, and that's very much still there physically, but the ideologies and the philosophy behind it aren't. Yeah, Bob Dylan first lived here when he moved to Woodstock before he had his own house. Men with pallets. So it was laid out by these two English guys who were very much under the influence of William Morris, and they bought this whole hillside just outside of Woodstock, and kind of built a series of cottages all through the hills. So obviously I'm interested in the architectural, component of these communities, because it's one way of expressing their kind of view of life and nature. These are picnic outings, to go plein air painting. You can visit it today, but again, there's the actual work that's being done there is not very interesting. It's, it moved on to other things. It's sort of an arts and crafts kind of center now. That's a beautiful porch. George Bellows was one of the better known painters who was there. And Milton Avery actually had a place there, had a studio there. He's wonderful, yeah, and this is one of his landscapes of Woodstock area. That's the theater that's still there. And then a place I was lucky to go a couple of times actually is the McDowell Colony, which, you know, is pretty much known as just an artist's and a writer's residency program in New Hampshire. But it really started with much more of a kind of utopian idea of American artists getting together. You know, the founder was obviously McDowell was a well-known composer Edward McDowell was from Boston, a composer. That's the map of the, you know, you have the central hall, and then you have, you know, all these wonderful cottages scattered through the landscape. And it is incredible to stay there because he'll show you some of the, you know, each one is, you know, they're very quaint, and each one is designed by a different designer. And, you know, I've stayed in 2 different ones. And, you know, they bring you lunch in a little basket. And you get so bored because you have so much time to work, you know, you don't have enough distractions, you know. So whenever my lady with the basket would come up, I'd run out and say, come and talk to me, hang out, have part of my sandwich. And they bring whatever sandwich you want and all that stuff, you know, and it's classic. I mean, it's a little bit like Yaddo, but it's, you know, it has these separate little structures. And in each cottage, there's a wooden plaque, and you put your name, you burn your name, or you write your name in it, you know, so you can see who's been in that cottage. And there's one that, you know, some famous writer committed suicide, and so people avoid that one. But Yoko was in one of the cottages. I was very proud of that. The Yoko Ono had spent a month there. So it's you know, again, and now it's just sort of morphed into a very respected. They've changed. They don't call it McDowell Colony anymore. As of 2 years ago, I think they decided it was too imperialistic sounding. So, is this mic okay? Is it popping a lot? Yeah. Or should I just stay back a little bit? Yeah. So, again, I'm being way too encyclopedic. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was on that. Right. No, I don't know. Actually, I don't know. I think they were in the middle of changing it, but they decided to take away. So I think it's just the McDowell. It's just maybe McDowell. I don't know. I'll have to check on that. Get back to me on that. But you know, around the same time, very early on, 1899, this art school and art group started in Cape Cod. I want to just set that up because then, you know, when we get back to East Hampton, Provincetown sort of becomes a counterbalance to the post-war Hamptons art community. You know, I mean, Robert Motherwell was so involved here, but wasn't here that long. Built that famous house and studio with Pierre Chareau, and then around 1954 or 55, I always thought it might be like, you know, Jackson Pollock was here, de Kooning was here. He was in the big, I mean, he'd come before them actually. And maybe he was like, you know, there's not enough room for all of us here, so he moved to Provincetown. I just love this photograph. That's why I had it as the thing, but it's the Oxbow School of Art, which again isn't really community, but it acted as that for a lot of people. It did become kind of, you know, a study in social practice, and that's what a lot of these groups that either start very amorphously as just a group of friends or as an art school can often turn into that kind of thing. This is the layout of Oxbow. But this is, for anyone who knows the work I'm doing with Norman Jaffe, this was a weird serendipitous kind of discovery. I was looking for an image of Klaus Oldenburg, who you can see is on the left there with the apron on, because he's sort of one of the most prominent artists who went to Oxbow. And there in the middle, in the front row, is Norman Jaffe. And I'd been searching for some kind of proof that Norman had actually attended Oxbow School of Summer Art, because he had been at the University of Chicago, or the Art Institute of Chicago. And this was kind of part of their summer program. And there he is. He's about 19 years old, so it was a great discovery. Moving back to East Hampton in the 30s, pre-war, you know, dancers like Anita Zahn are doing experimental modern dance right on the ocean. She was a friend and lovers with one of the Muschenheims up in Hampton Bays. This is those famous 1930s beach houses that William Muschenheim had designed for his father. That's William Jr.'s wife and child. And this is very, there's never been a book much written about this group of Hampton Bays artists, because these were exiles from Europe, I mean, including Andre Breton and Jacqueline Lamba. David Berliak, who was sort of, like one of the big surrealists and not very well known in this country. Ashel Gorky, not really associated with the abstract expressionists in East Hampton so much as he was with this group in Hampton Bays. And David Hare, who luckily when I was at Yale, I actually invited up, and he came, and he was alive, and he looked as extraordinary as that picture, and he a sculptor. And that's Ashel Gorky with Andre Breton, somewhere in Hampton Bays in 1944. So these guys came from, to get away from Europe and the war, and how they ended up there. But I do know the Muschenheims are very much a part of it. He had a lot of friends from Europe, and they were sort of welcome in his house. He had a big rambling house in Hampton Bays. Breton wrote this poem to Jacqueline Lamba. There will always be a wind-borne shovel in the sand of dreams. And that's his getting his heart broken in Hampton Bays in 1944, because David Hare, who's like 30 years younger or whatever, is flirting with Jacqueline on the beach at Hampton Bays. So, and that's all I know about it, but the rest is, up to your imagination. But I think it's amazing that that was going on during World War II, in Hampton Bays of all places. So, which, nothing, I'm not dissing Hampton Bays, it just, I just thought. And then meanwhile, up in Amagansett, Max Ernst, who has to go to Riverhead once a week or twice a month or something to report to the FBI because he's a German national living in America, gets to know young Robert Motherwell. Bob Motherwell could speak, French fluently, so he was very much, appreciated by Andre Breton and all the Europeans who spoke French. And that's Bob and Max Ernst playing chess in Amagansett. The cemetery in the back there, I forget the name of the street. The cottage he had was right near there in Amagansett. Post-war Hamptons. I mean, this I talk about so often, so and all of you know this. So I'll just buzz through it quickly. But again, it's not a cohesive school or attempt at a colony, but it is in a sense of, with Motherwell here getting so much publicity, and then obviously Pollock getting more than anyone, and just the comings and goings. It was still very simple out here. It wasn't crowded. My parents moved out here in the early 50s, and they were so amazed by just, it was fishermen and farmers and a few country club types, but then all these artists and writers, and they found it so fascinating. Just down the street was Jeffrey Potter and Penny Potter, who introduced them to Pollock and de Kooning and Peter Matheson and on and on. It was such an incredibly creative. I love this. Jeff Heatley took this photograph somehow hanging from the rafters of the Pollock studio. He got this shot of the full floor, which I thought is wonderful. Tino Nivolos and Ruth Nivolos, incredible, social, talk about social construct. The Nivola Garden became this wonderful social center in Springs. There's the wall that's still there with the tree growing through it. Kiesler, just literally, a few houses down from the Nivolas, is working on his endless house. Bob Motherwell, we know this very well. I'm sure you know this. The house that Pierre Chareau designed for him, along with the studio. And Maria, his really amazing wife that we don't know that much about, but she was a model. She was also a painter and a poet in her own right. They had apparently fiercely violent arguments that could be heard around the neighborhood. Then he broke up with her in '52 and moved up to Provincetown and built a studio on Commercial Street in Provincetown. Then married Helen Frankenthaler in 1958, and they became their own kind of art colony up there. I mean, they became the most prominent names. These are some of the paintings he did based on that, right on the waterfront there. Black Mountain, which is really, one of the main subjects of the study I've been doing. The way it started is an alternative school in North Carolina, right outside of Asheville. But again, became this kind of revolution in artists, working communally and cooperatively. with the amazing teachers, quite a few from the Bauhaus, like Annie Albers and her husband Albers and Buckminster Fuller. It's very well known. The first building was going to be done by Gropius of the Bauhaus and Breuer, his partner. That was the plan. I don't know if you can see it very well. It's an old newspaper clipping. That was too expensive. So a guy named A. Lawrence Coker, who's not as well known, but actually did a lot of important work on Long Island and was a huge part of my early study on Long Island modernism years ago. This is what he designed instead, this one kind of single long building along Lake Eden. This is a house he did in Northport, Long Island that I featured in my show, Long Island Modern, many years ago. And it was an idea to build a house wrapped in canvas. I mean, it's such a cool little house. It didn't last very long. And yeah, because it rotted, I guess. But the canvas Association of America paid for some of it and provided to show that you could build a house with canvas. But again, it didn't last very long. But anyway, he's often eclipsed by Albert Frey, his partner, who's much better known and did all those famous modernist houses in Palm Springs. But Coker did so much important work. So that's what it looked like when it was finished. And this looks like almost a corporate campus or something, but it was built by all the students, by hand, very slowly, with corrugated metal siding. And there you can see a corner of it there, and there's a Bucky Fuller dome, and that's Bucky. A lot of this is now. Of course, it became this incredibly fertile ground for collaboration. That's Rauschenberg on the lower right in one of Merce Cunningham's performances. And it sort of credited this period with the first happening, which was supposedly Rauschenberg's idea. And it involved all the people you can see in that sketch. I don't know if you could read, there was a Franz Klein painting. Merce Cunningham did the choreographer. David Tudor, who's a well-known pianist and composer, he did the music. Again, I'm going back to Paul Goodman. Near the end of it, Paul Goodman was teaching writing at Black Mountain. Bob Motherwell was teaching painting. So all these people were there. This is when Goodman, this is what Goodman was referring to. I quoted this earlier in the talk. That this idea of that, in fact, because it was falling up by 56, 57, they couldn't afford to keep Black Mountain going. So they kind of agreed to close it down, but a whole group of not only the teachers, younger teachers, but quite a lot of the students decided to move north. They wanted to be closer to New York. And this idea that Paul Goodman said, this is how it should be. It should only last like, 10 to 15, 20 years at the most, and then move on, to something else. So this area, which I don't know if anyone here knows about this community, I'd love to talk to them because I'm just discovering it. I often would drive by Stony Point, New York, on the Palisades, Parkway, and someone had said, yeah, Jasper Johns lived there for a long time. I'm saying, oh, why did Jasper Johns live there? That's interesting. So I'd started to poke around a bit. And it turned out that this whole group of Black Mountain College students and teachers just moved up there. I won't go back to them. Again, very much based on Paul and Percival Goodman's ideas in Communitas. There's the 1960 edition of it, which was very much about it's okay to leave the city. It was very much a kind of a manifesto of how to live outside of the corporate capitalist American society. And this was on the right there. So on the left are two projects that Percy Goodman, who I got to know when I was doing Long Island Art, and what an amazing man he was. And he had a house in Springs. And on the upper left was a project he did up Island, which was going to be this modernist housing project, really early, like 32 or something like that. And the contractors kind of hated him. They called him a commie, and didn't know how to build a cantilever or flat roof or anything like that. So Percy got so upset and was worried that this house would kind of collapse and kill someone. So he asked his brother to help him. One night they went out there and either set fire to the house or just literally tore it down somehow. Now I don't know how true that is. It's sort of out of the Fountainhead, with Gary Cooper, burning that building down. But it's a story Percy told, very well. And that was a house, an aluminum house. Right below that is the aluminum house that was built for a site in Montauk. It was never built, I'm sorry, but it was designed for a house in Montauk. And those are Percy's concepts for communal housing, very much out of the Bauhaus and European modernism, for a collective thing. And so this Paul Williams, who, again, if anyone here knew Paul Williams, or Vera Williams, his wife and partner, let me know, because there's very little known about him. But he'd inherited, his father was some kind of engineer, electrical engineer, had made a discovery and made a lot of money, died quite young, left Paul quite a lot, like a few million. And Paul immediately just put it into Black Mountain. He kept Black Mountain College going for the last 4 or 5 years. And then it kind of fell apart. And instead he bought 650 acres upstate New York, near the Harriman State Park, and created this community, invited all these people, and they came, including Merce Cunningham. John Cage was really the center of it. Karen Carnes, who's very much part of this world, Jacqueline Earl Larson, she was a very close friend of Jack's. If you go to the Roundhouse, Jack's first house over here, like the chimneys, the window frames, a lot of the furniture was Karen Carnes. David Tudor, the composer. So they all came up. Cage, it was really, this is where John Cage really kind of found his mojo. The woods around the community are filled with mushrooms. He became obsessed with mycology and mushrooms. He wrote Silence, which is a huge book for me when I was 21 or whenever I read it. It was such an influential book. Did some of his most radical compositions there. And then Vera, the Williams' wife, was printing just in their kitchen, sort of up there, this incredible, radical magazine called Liberation. These are her covers, which I think are very beautiful, silk screen covers that she did by hand. And that's Paul Williams' original concept for Gate Hill Cooperative. Again, very much based on Percy Goodman's kind of notion of a collective, and that's them just building it by hand. That was the Williams and John Cage's house. It was like a bipolar kind of house. John Cage got the part that sticks into the mountain, and that's Cage's fireplace, which was this copper kind of thing, and he had just a regular open fire underneath it, and it was kind of open to nature. And that's them working on them. The upper, so this is still there. It's in pretty good shape. The upper square. That was taken a few years ago, so it's kind of what it's like now. And then nearby, just down the hill a little bit, was Stan Vanderbeek's incredible movie drome. So he wanted to build a Bucky Fuller dome, a little bit like this, but the formula wasn't public yet. He didn't know how to do a dome. In fact, Fuller hadn't really built a dome yet either. So he found a large silo, like an old farm silo, and was able to buy the top of it, the dome top of it, and then built this platform and created the dome, and then would show these multimedia, slide projectors and film projectors onto the, he painted the inside white, and you'd come up through a trapdoor in the middle, lie on these mattresses on the floor, and you'd have this incredible, experience. I'm not going to read this out because I can barely read it. But the idea was this was going to be the first movie trome, and there'd be, it's a little bit like the concept behind the Fly's Eye Dome. This was going to be one of, a million such structures that would be connected by satellite, all kinds of high-tech things. And now we have Zoom instead. And the movie drone, Stan Vanderbeek's movie drone, was going to be connected by satellites. And that, in a way it was like the internet, but it was going to be these domes around the world, and you'd communicate with China and whatever. And kind of fantastic, but it had a huge influence at the time because at New York Film Festival, I think it was 64, 65, he invited everybody up, and like hundreds of people came up and saw it and were very influenced. They were also, the Williams at the same time, Vera and Paul were supporting all this incredible, innovation and invention. They were also bought and supported the Living Theater in the not for the whole period, but from 59 to 63. Living Theater was in the 14th Streets Theater and the Williams. So there was a lot of interplay between the Living Theater group and everybody else, and Rauschenberg and Cage and everybody up at Gate Hill Community. This just sold, I think, like 2 years ago or a year ago. This is Jasper John's studio up there. And he had his own private house in his place, but this just sold, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. And John, later in that period, like early 70s, John Lennon and Yoko would go up there because they were friends with this guy, what's his name again? Rip Hayman, who's a composer. I don't know his work. And this is a big transition, but it like fits in with all this group because a lot of these people were also involved in Black Mountain, and it's often Drop City is often remembered as sort of the ultimate hippie psychedelic, commune, which it turned into at one point. But it started as in 1960 as just a kind of a 24-hour, 360 days a year alternative to capitalist living in New York. And it was a group of artists from Kansas City and University of Colorado who had all worked with, on happenings with different artists of the happening kind of period. And they went out and bought this there was op art in the 60s and there was pop art in the 60s, and they decided we'll be drop artists. That was the idea. And they actually dropped things from the roof of buildings in Kansas City. Is this a drop-in? That's one of the Capro, they worked with Alan Capro. He had actually taught there for a while, so they sort of were turned on to the idea of happenings. And then they went out to this nowhere, in the middle of nowhere, southern Colorado, and bought this old goat farm and built it. They couldn't figure out a perfect geodesic dome, so this is actually called a dodecahedron or something like that. It's not the perfect, because Bucky wouldn't share the formula at that point. So this one solo, and they ended up figuring out, with a guy named Steve Baer, they figured out they could go to these automobile graveyards, and for nothing, I think they'd pay the guy maybe, $10 or $5 or something. And they would, with axes, stand on the roof of these cars and chop out these sections of metal. Then they would shape into triangular forms that would create the domes. It's kind of extraordinary. And there's the theater dome on the left. And that was the communal kind of dome that they would do all their art actions and their performances and their music in. And then and then this is it kind of at its peak, and each one was completely unique and different. The patchwork colors, because it was the different colors of the different cars that they were chopping this metal out. I mean, it was just so much, and it was all about, we don't want any of the materialism. The saying was, you can kind of live in America with nothing because there's so much refuse and garbage from, the 1% or whatever you want to call it. That there's plenty there. There's so much excess that you don't need to buy anything. You can just find it all right there. So these buildings are this beautiful kind of affirmation of that sense of leaving capitalist society. It didn't last very long, of course. And what happens is, and this happens in so many of these communities, at this period, Esquire magazine wrote a piece about how cool Drop City was, and so all these young dropouts, because they saw Drop City as drop out, kind of, like Leary's saying, right? Tune in, turn on, drop out. But it wasn't. It was about throwing shoes out of, rooftops. So they started to get inundated by all these young, runaway druggies who were, and suddenly they were looking after like 17-year-old kids, who were ODing and stuff like that. So a whole group of them said, to hell with this, and just left it as it was and said, you can have it, you keep it. They found it, that's their group painting. They used to do these group actions, and here's the ultimate, it's called the ultimate painting. It kind of rolled around, and everybody worked on it, and they did it in a theater dome. There's some other ones. That's someone proudly holding the ultimate painting. Anyway, they got together, the sort of the core founders, and found this much more difficult to find, in fact, very obscure in southern Colorado, a very mountainous site of 300 or 400 acres. And the idea was that, you know, you just were left on your own. The only rule they had was you had to build your own structure, but you couldn't see another structure from it. You couldn't like interfere with anyone else's, because there was plenty of room on this mountainside. But it was tough going. It was very hard to find. I could never find it. I mean, without very specific directions. So suddenly runaways and things like that, and hippie runaways couldn't come and find it. It was called Libre Commune. And it's still going. They celebrated their 50th anniversary, I think a year or two ago. There's some of the structures they built. And you know, there are painters like Dean Fleming, Linda Fleming, who's a very well-known sculptor. Dean was part of this, you know, that kind of new color field movement in the 60s. And he just wanted to be able to paint on his own. There's my friend Roberta Price, harvesting a really good, you know, harvest of marijuana from the hillside. And she was she was great. She had a fellowship from Yale to write a PhD thesis on alternative American communities, and she got to Libre and never left. And she's now become like, you know, she's an amazing woman. She's one of the top prosecutors defense attorneys for Native American like issues around New Mexico and Arizona, and does great work out there. But that's her in her prime. Dean Fleming and Linda's, they're two domes. Again, it was just a studio. You know, the big one was the studio inside, and they lived there with their babies. And then this, you know, here we are at Mildred's Lane. I have no idea if this is going to work. I hope it does. I hope we get Morgan Puett online with us.
I'm here.
She said, welcome, Morgan Puett. Oh, cool. There you are. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't get to see all those images.
Oh, but you fit right in. So we gave a quick introduction, but let me give a quick personal one, which is we've known Morgan for what, 24 years or whatever. You've looked after all my kids. You've taught them how to live socially together, and you know, you've had an enormous impact, not just on the world of artists in and around New York and upstate New York, but just in your community. You've created so many different kind of resources for creative people. So start at the beginning. Like, I love creation stories. How did you guys start?
Oh, you haven't shown any images yet, right?
No, I will.
Well, it's a long story, but I was living already up here, moving back and forth between New York City and here. I created a series of storefront installations, as I refer to them, because I wasn't really a fashion designer. I was an artist. I studied art. I studied sculpture, painting, filmmaking, and was doing large-scale outdoor installations. And I started this series of storefront projects that out of them emerged this body of clothing that I was really interested in, kind of resisting the fashion system as we know it, and making these kind of Depression era style clothes and furniture and interiors. And but I was moving back and forth and living in my brother Garnet Puett's cottage up in Tyler Hill, just 10 miles north of here. And I was very happy there. I did the same thing I'm doing now, was doing over there. But I met Mark Dion in the early 90s, and we started looking for our own place and a piece of land to do bigger scale things on, and found this place after looking for several years. We tried to go in with different partners at first. I don't know, some of you might remember Colin DeLand and Pat Hearn, who were gallery owners in the late 80s and early 90s. Unfortunately and sadly, they were so brilliant and they died early. And then we ended up buying this place with Renee Green and Nils Norman, who were our partners at first. But
How many acres was it, or again?
well, at first it was 86 point something acres, and then later Mark and I, well, actually our neighbor practically gave us 5 acres because another neighbor was giving us trouble, and he gave us acreage so that we could own this part of our lane.
Right. And when did you start to when did you start to think of having it as
Well,
a
from
as a
day
residency?
one, because
Yeah,
like I
yeah,
said, I was
yeah.
already doing that
Yeah,
over in
yeah.
Tyler Hill before I met Mark, bringing everybody out to the country. I mean, it's the same way all these things start, I think, Alastair, is like people searching for a place to be free and express themselves openly and follow and discourse around the topics that really excite us and drive us. And it's cheaper in the country. But we moved here. Renee and Niels soon, very shortly after, had a tragic divorce and floated off. And it was just Mark and I, and we immediately, all of our friends started convening here.
Right.
And there was nothing here but this beautiful series of little agrarian structures, vernacular structures, 18th century farm. There's an old homestead here with the mid 1700s hearth. So it was old, and it seems to be that the early colonial settlers coming from Connecticut, they called the Connecticut settlers, came over the Delaware and started skirmishing with the Lenape indigenous people. And, for a good 50 or so years, they were murdering and killing each other. And the Lenape they kept moving west. And so there was a community here.
Yeah. When was your first real, like what you call, sessions where you invite artists and then you invite fellows? So they're like students. Some of them are like students, but some of them
First of all,
yeah.
I started early on doing, as soon as technology allowed, kind of live link-ins with gallery situations where I was showing in a gallery in Santa Barbara, California, but we were all doing things here. So throughout the whole gallery exhibition, people would walk in the gallery, and whatever we were doing here, either sitting around a campfire or building a bonfire, or I curated my friends to do little performances for people who were walking in the gallery in California. So we were starting things early on in the early 2000s. And then, well, Mark and I separated, but kept our family very close together through this idea I had about let's start an alternative school. And our friends and colleagues would be the session leaders. So we started a series of open sessions in 2008 was the very first one. And we've been doing those sessions ever since.
And the people live, they come and stay there. So you just explain what it is, so it's usually in the summer.
The session is any one of our colleagues, and now we call them our advisory council, who come up with an idea to do a session around a project. Sometimes they're projects, sometimes they're just more theoretical topics. Sometimes they're about building this landscape, because this landscape isn't just designed and built by me, but it's built by all of our friends. Right. There are hundreds of hands that have put in. And that first session, for example, we wanted to have a pond here. We just had a little sinkhole up in one corner of the land that I would swim in, but couldn't really swim. We needed a real pond. And so we asked the question first, what is a pond? So the very first session was my session, and I had one fellow that showed up to that session that was sent by a sending institution, we call them, but art schools and universities around the world who support students to come study with us. Excuse me. And that was What is a Pond? And it was David Brooks,
Right.
young artist who's now quite renowned and travels the world and does this amazing work. And he will be leading a session with Mark, Diane, and Brian Holmes and Claire Pentecost, some other friends of ours from Chicago, this summer. So anyway, that was the very first session, and it kind of rolled out like that. Is anything we needed to fix or build here? I mean, we're artists, we couldn't really afford it, so we would convene around a session and critically and topically engage with whatever came through that conversation, and then everybody would work.
Yeah.
Work together.
What I remember so well over the last 20 years coming up there, as I said, with our family growing up with yours, it was not even, more than even at a university, or a bohemian setting, you would meet, you really curated the people that came. There was this feeling like these were like people you wouldn't meet anywhere else, and they were from all over Europe, all over the world, and they come together, and you just did really basic things like, repair stone walls, make bonfires, make dinners. Your whole act of what you call hooshing and what you call, work styles, is about art as a social construct, which I'd been talking about in my talk today. That's really the principle. Now, each individual artist can do whatever they want to do, right? They're there. But those moments where they're together, coming together, that seemed to create so much synergy, so much creative electricity. And every time I went, I remember, and it wasn't always true, but so much of the time, you would just meet these incredible people that you would become best friends with and, see continuously again. And there are just so few places you can do that now, because there was no pressure. Yeah, you could do whatever you want, basically. Yeah, and you provided the context for that. Yeah.
Well, it was because we were traveling the world, doing exhibitions and inviting people from all over the world to come here. But it's also our Manhattan friends who were coming in and out of, for the weekend. So that was nonstop up until COVID. COVID really dampened everything. But it was the alternative school,
Right.
because the younger artists started coming. Were sent and supported by the institutions, and that was the brilliant little machine that I designed to lift it out and spread the word, kind of, and that meant also those young artists grew into being professional career artists. And now this is 27 years later, and they're still coming back. Right. So, and they're bringing their students.
Why do you think it was so difficult? Because remember, we did that thing with MoMA, and you had associations with I know Art Institute of Chicago, Yale at one point, right? University of Pennsylvania. Why was it so difficult, or maybe it wasn't difficult? Why did those relationships not last longer? Why was it difficult to be open and free and anarchic, but then somehow fit together with an institutional program?
First of all, like I said, COVID changed everything.
Yeah.
And then the schools
right.
became more conservative. I mean, the trend is more conservative now, and they're kind of coddling those young art students more like children. It's not really the same since COVID.
Right.
So it's not so easy to rebuild that. I'm trying to rebuild that system of sending institutions. And now what I'm doing is finding philanthropic colleagues and people who can support students, can support an artist to come to Mildred's Lane. That's working this year better than ever.
Right.
Finding the people who believe in the project and will give a scholarship to a fellow
Right.
to attend for 1, 2, or 3 weeks.
Right.
And that seems to be how we're going to get through this summer. But honestly, it's year to year, we don't know how it's going to work.
But you've been going for over 25 years. That's that's extraordinary. I mean, which I think is obviously your energy and your vision. But you and I talked once about what do you do when the bad apple comes in? Because that happens. So I remember a couple of summers that there was such a great deal of harmony, and we were meeting so many amazing people, and everybody was really riffing off each other. And there was some, weird dude that comes in and just is wrong. Like, how do you know that? How do you deal with that?
First of
How do
all,
you
we
vote
try
them
to-
off the island, I guess is the question, right?
Well, you can't. Well, you can. I've asked people to leave,
Yeah.
but
How do you do that?
the thing that happens is, well, a retired police lieutenant told me this. There is this system that he or cops use. It's called 181. That's pretty much the way the world is. It's like there's always one person who's just willing to be the superhero and do everything and be really cooperative, and help everybody else to, get the gumption up. And then there are 8 others who will just follow and do what everybody is doing and with good spirit. But then there's always one who's the troublemaker, who wants to start a mutiny, who wants to disrupt the the mechanism, who wants to, poke holes in the system. I mean, it's 181. So yes, sometimes there's that person, but then sometimes there are schisms that just naturally occur
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
a person feels like they're not getting enough credit for what they're doing.
Right.
Or that really is the thing that has popped up many times.
So just ego, kind of not wanting, needing recognition, needing more
Ego.
attention. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I have
Well, you start off by teaching them how to stage set your refrigerator, which I always think is kind of a good way to start.
You're referring to work styles. Are you showing any images?
No, I can't. We're technically. I'll show images as soon as you and I start.
Oh, the technology screwed up?
Yeah, a little bit.
Well, anyway, work styles is the philosophy I created early on to try to have some system to find the common ground. There has to be a commons.
Do you want that?
Is everything okay?
Yeah. Keep going. Keep talking.
Because people come from all cultures, all walks of life, and they have different expectations of somebody being at home. Bruce Mao, designer, architect, writer, was writing a few decades ago about revitalizing the word lifestyles and kind of infusing it with
Can
all
you
of
hear
this
her still?
design.
Yeah. Good.
And-
Cool. Thank you. Keep
and
going.
I
Mark.
just and pulling it away from the commercialism of the 20th century, but I found that was just a little bit off the mark because as creative thinkers, as artists, work is our life. We love to work. We love to work on projects. We're project artists. And so when you think about it, we're weaving our life through our work. And that's where I came up with this term in response to Bruce Mao's lifestyle, work styles. And in work styles, it's critically challenging and asking the questions that are about how we live, what our being is on the planet, like our relationships first and foremost with the environment. We are definitely environmentally conscientious creatures, and it's the core of everything we do, as is domesticity at home. And next, it's also the relationships between each other, because it's so difficult to get along with people in the world. We're all different. And so grounding ourselves in the commons called work styles is essential. And then next is just the design apparatus, the dwelling, how we live, where we sleep. I mean, for me, the home and where you sleep is the most universal system there is in the world. It's like to make sure that everybody has a cozy bed and a little room of their own. That's what home should be. So I think that also is balled up into work styles. And and then how to maintain that home. And then next is how do you divide up labor? The labor system, the systems of labor is top of the structure is that it's a shared labor system. There's no service industry. So we're resisting capitalism, we're resisting the hierarchy of a corporation or a museum structure where there's a director and there's a janitor, but we're all doing all of these things. Everybody's directing something and curating somewhere, and above all, everybody's cleaning. So we have this system called work styles with 17 labors, and we divide up the labors on a day-to-day basis. And
Hey, Morgan, can you see the images I'm showing?
no,
No. Okay. I'm at the one where there are four of you dressed up as your ambassador to.
these are the labors.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they're
Explain that. Yeah,
allegorical
yeah.
portraits called the Labor Portraits of Mildred's Lane. And we're going into a session where we're finishing the last 5 for the book, the publication called Work Styles that we're almost finished with.
And you're ambassador of Entanglements. Is that
Well,
correct?
what do you want me to be?
I
The
don't know.
boss, the director? I mean, it's
No, it's
because
best. And you
my
are
role's too
an
complicated.
ambassador to I mean, there are a lot of entanglements that you.
Yes, very much so. And the terms are pulled out of contemporary theory, a lot of writers and thinkers, and we mix them up and we playfully and in a very game-like game-like manner come up with these titles. And it's trickled down into these 17 labors, and the portraits allegorically explain them, but the publication will go into more depth about them.
It's wonderful. Morgan, I just want to show you, there's a sketch you gave me the other day of early on when you guys were kind of conceiving of the physical plan of what this thing could be. You had these sort of half-ruined old 18th century structures around. Talk about that a little. It's a little map that you drew, I think, of the different buildings and how you conceived of them. Then I have that great aerial shot of Mildred's Lane as more or less how it looks now.
Well, yeah, it started with the little outbuildings and vernacular structures that came with the site.
Right.
And many of them crumbling in a state of entropy. They were just falling apart. So we were kind of merging our contemporary sculpture practices with these buildings and creating places to live and sleep. And one of the first ones is the Horseshed House. I don't know if I gave you that.
Yeah, I think I have it. Yeah. Talk about. I have two shots. I have a couple of shots of Mildred's house, which I think is such an interesting story. So let me go to those and just tell us about Mildred and why she's your community is named after her.
Well, it's just so interesting because when we bought the property with an old man in it. There was the nephew of Mildred, this lady Mildred, and this man was 65 years old, which at the time seemed to me to be really old, but it's not really old at all. And he told us all about his aunt Mildred, who lived there with her shack. She was shacked up with this guy named Miller, and they called this the Old Miller Farm for so long, which offended me because it was the Steffens family who bought it at the turn of the century, 1900. We titled it Mildred's Lane because there was also a big, hairy, litigious battle over, do we get to use the lane? Because it's a landlocked property of now 93 acres, embedded in about 600 acres in this, between two little mountains and a stream. So it's this glen of forest and this opening of a few meadows with this old homestead there, just by a crow's fly, a quarter mile off the Delaware River.
I'm just showing, Morgan, I'm just showing an image of your installation at that gallery in New York. I just, the clothes dipped in beeswax and that.
Yes, yes. I use a lot of beeswax. I come from 4 generations of beekeepers, and that was me archiving my well, she said fashion design systems in my storefronts, but that wasn't just the clothing, it was all of my schematics and drawings, the schematics of all of those storefront installations that I designed
Right.
between in the mid 80s through up till 2000.
Right. That didn't start the fire. Was that the one that started the fire?
No, I did not start a fire. That's just a rumor and gossip.
It's a rumor that I keep spreading. But I have a great shot of an early dinner party that Barbara and I came to, and we helped you, and you had these great stacks of moss and then these sticks with food on them. Do you remember that? And then some of the tables had old Victorian hat pins with the food on it. We were all worried we'd get these Victorian diseases from the hat pins. But the importance of the kitchen at Mildred's Lane and the importance of these group dinners that are just unbelievable. Every once in a while there would be a kind of a bummer, like the roadkill dinner was difficult to handle.
And you brought up the fermentation.
Oh, the fermentation was the worst. We all had diarrhea for 2 weeks afterwards. But these concepts, these to me were like the great happenings of the present age, these themes.
We started that whole system. We really were on the, early days of the tiny house movement, and then, the very experimental kitchen movement.
Right.
We were already using algorithms to create a meal, like Fluxus and like all of those great art history moments. We were just reinventing those here as games and for our collective engagement.
But you also told me that, and I thought it was extraordinary, and I understood it, this sense of that a younger generation of students who'd come to work with you, that they'd really never given a dinner party or been part of a dinner party. And I think there is a whole generation that doesn't have that social experience, they just aren't getting it, or I don't know how they're eating.
And I saw that as when I was swanning in and instructing as an art instructor all over the country in art schools, and people didn't understand even the table setting, and I understand the napkin ring. I'll explain it to you later. We have our own system.
Yeah.
And it was really important to to demonstrate to a young artist how to set a formal table, but then fuck with it. Make it really interesting. Redesign it, pull it apart and put it back together again in a different way. And so those were early games that we were playing out.
I'm just showing a picture of Barbara with, I think it was the Bruegel dinner party where she
Yes, I pulled out my collection of antique underwear from the from the 19th century and earlier, and we arranged them in the landscape. Barbara's Bruegel, like the Bruegel great Bruegel painting Laundry Day, I think.
Yeah, I think it's Laundry Day, where the women are hanging out their linens and stuff. Yeah.
So we were doing a lot of that thing, looking at art history and playfully reassembling those terms.
This is great. I guess we're getting ready to. What else should we say in terms of, because I know it's an ongoing challenge to keep going. Financially, in terms of structurally, and different people coming and going. What is, and one of the quotes I think you probably heard was about maybe it's okay, these things kind of atomize on their own, and they go out and they seed other projects and all these young people. You've had so many amazing young fellows who've come through and gone on to do incredibly inspiring kind of acts of their own. Yeah, it's amazing. It's like a family, an ongoing family. What is the secret to keeping it going, or maybe not keeping it going? What do you feel the future of Mildred's Lane is going to be?
Well, it's definitely not the same as it was, 27 years ago. And it's the hardest thing. I mean, it's the struggle because I personally am not concentrated in that capitalist system where we got to make money. The finally, what I ended up doing was becoming a nonprofit last year. This is our first year as a nonprofit,
Right.
just so we could start writing the operational grants, because the most important thing is it takes 17 labors to run a system. I mean, a museum, how many employees does it take to run a museum? This
Right.
place is now a museum. We have a huge collection of contemporary art. We've got collections of everyday objects. It's a collection of vernacular structures, many made by contemporary artists. It's a little landscape museum, and it needs a staff. And the 17 labors are based on what it takes to run a home,
Right.
a domestic environment.
Right.
And so, looking through that lens of domesticity and the home, there's suddenly all these other complicated or complex scenarios that you need help with. And oftentimes it all ends up on my shoulders. And honestly, in the last few years, it nearly killed me. I mean, I got really depressed. I just thought this is impossible
Right.
to do alone,
Right.
because COVID was, we're all holed up in our homes alone.
Right.
And that's when I started thinking that the nonprofit would help me so that we could write grants. I mean, I was getting a lot of awards and grants, for 20 years. I got all the awards, much of which helped Peabody too. We joke about
Peabody's Mark Dion. Yeah.
Yeah, oh sorry,
Yeah.
Mark Dion, who's still my business partner and my best friend, and we have a kid together. But he's married to someone else with another kid. And we joke about like, oh, the Alpert Award helped build our fireplace, or the Anonymous Woman Award that I got, helped sheathe the walls of the house. And
Right.
I mean, every time we get a little bit of money, we're able to do something with it.
Right.
So money doesn't come and get wasted. It gets put to work.
Yeah.
So the nonprofit, the idea of becoming a nonprofit was going to help, but then Trump came in, and well, everybody knows what happened. Everybody got defunded. So we're kind of stuck with no way to write grants except for private foundations,
Right.
and at the same time more bureaucracy, because the nonprofit system is so bureaucratic.
Right.
Um,
So you're just figuring it out as you go
I'm
along.
figuring it out
Yeah,
as we
yeah,
go.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Anybody out there has any ideas, and anybody wants to support a young artist to come to Mildred's Lane, email us.
Yeah.
It's
No,
really-
we'll hand out the information. I just think while you're still on here, maybe there's some questions from the audience. I mean, anybody have any questions while Morgan's still with us in the virtual world? Anything? No? Oh yeah, go ahead.
Were you a fellow?
Me?
Mildred's Lane?
Me? No, just friend. Like we're sort of, she has a sort of, we all met, there's a great Montessori school up there, and we were kind of escaping New York and the Hamptons and everything, and we all met pretty much through our kids, I mean, the original group of friends who's helped to start it, and we're still very involved, usually year to year. But any questions for Morgan? Yeah, Kiki.
What's happening this summer?
What's happening this summer, Morgan? Morgan?
Wow, go to the website and download that info zine that was designed by Ms. Gordon.
Who's asked the question?
There are several sessions into October. And that's the one thing, is the way I'm going to experiment this year is do workshops in fall, winter this year, and see if that helps.
Right. If you just Google, sorry, Morgan, if you just Google Mildred's Lane, it comes up. I mean, the website comes up.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all this stuff. Thank you, Morgan, so much. It's really fascinating to have you, and I'm glad this worked out.
Yes, thank you, Alastair. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye. Bye. I just wanted to end with thank you, Morgan, so much. That was fantastic. And you know, she really has been keeping this place going for 25 years. And some years it seems like such an organic explosion of, you know, interconnectivity, and just everybody's supportive. And then, you know, the next, it's so much to do with just the chemistry between all the people. I just threw this in at the end because I didn't know much about it myself, but Paducah, Kentucky has this system by which you can buy a building for $1 in downtown Paducah. It's the Paducah Artists Relocation Program, which sounds almost like kind of Stalinistic, but you go in and apparently it's kind of I have no idea if it's any good, but I just wondered if anyone here knew about it. And you know, this is another idea of sort of commodifying creativity in a sense, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Certainly artists are still used, and real estate developers know very much how positive an impact artists can have. If you come into, you know, blown out industrial area or an old downtown that's been abandoned, and you invite some artists in, and they're willing to, you know, have a building for nothing, but they have to work their asses off to you know, to bring it back to life. Kind of amazing. So supposedly it's more than 30 million has been invested in restoring the community. A local bank is part of it too, which I think is really interesting. So with that, I'd like to tie it up. If there are any questions, this is sort of a freewheeling kind of, I'm just starting kind of thinking about this. I don't know if it's going to be a book, but it's, you know, there's a lot of compelling ideas coming together. So if you have any questions, let me know. Yeah, go ahead.
You had a place, Norfolk, I guess, where
I can't hear you. So, speak up.
Norfolk was a place that Yale sent undergraduate art students and few graduate students. Is that still going?
I've heard of,
Summer program.
yeah, I've heard of that. I don't know if it's still going. I went to Yale, but I don't know if it's still going. Yeah. And yeah. Hi.
Do you know about Lindisfarne in North Sea?
Yeah, I mean, this is just a, you know, a kind of a cherry picking of some examples, you know, and some are, I think for me, you know, what happened out here in Black Mountain, and that, you know, Gate Hill is, have you ever heard, did you know about Gate Hill? No. Yeah, I didn't either. No one does, but these incredible characters are there. Yeah.
But Lindisfarne was right here on Fish Cove in North Sea.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was William Irwin Thompson who created the curriculum for Ross School. They were trying to solve planetary problems by bringing together various specialists from different disciplines, but Carl Sagan was there.
Wow. When was this, in the 70s or something? Or?
I think it was the early 70s,
Right,
but they had theologians, writers,
right.
painters,
Wow.
and they were on Fish Cove, which is in North Sea, and I think it was either an old camp or an old motel or something.
Right,
It was a camp.
right.
But there are just a handful of people who were involved with it still alive.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Anything else? Anybody else?
What was the refrigerator?
Oh, you have to see it. Yeah. I'd never seen anything like it. I opened, you know, to get a.
Refridging.
Are you still there?
The
No.
game. It's called refridging.
Oh, refrigerator. So she's there. But you open her refrigerator and it's just beautiful. And it's like, I mean, why not? You know, usually most refrigerators are kind of ugly. But everything, and her fellows, often the first thing they have to do is, you know, just decorate the refrigerator. You know, and there's bits of
They have
laid.
to conceptually pull everything out and reinstall it like it's an
Right.
installation work.
Right. And it's beautiful, you know, and you go, hey, I never thought about this. Why don't I decorate my refrigerator more beautifully? But the kitchen is the heart of the place, isn't it, Morgan? The dinners and everything, yeah. You're still there. I thought you went.
I was trying to listen to them, but I
Okay.
can't hear the questions. I was
Yeah, it's
just
hard.
listening.
It's hard. Any other questions for anybody? Okay. Thank you guys very much. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Morgan.
Thank you.